The United States conflict with Russia, which some say is self-made, has taken different dimensions. With a focus to create instability in the Eurasia region, comprised of countries like Ukraine, possibly Kazakhstan being the latest victim. Now, in this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at the nature of the West's new rivalry with Russia. Even though it is different from that of the Cold War during the Soviet era, geopolitical and social developments in Eurasia are becoming more like the events and alliances of the 19th and of the early 20th centuries. Our guest joining us to break this down for us and give us an insight, Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, political analyst, and author, joins us from London. Also joining us, Earl Rasmussen, Executive Vice President of the Eurasian Center, who joins us from Washington, D.C. Well, I'd like to welcome you both, and I'm going to start first with you, Marcus Papadopoulos, if I may. Some may say, what is a color revolution, especially in Europe? If you can please explain to us what that means in the context, of course, of recent developments.
Let me first of all say that at the beginning of 1992, the West, intoxicated by its victory in the Cold War, following the end of communism in Eastern Europe and then the dissolution of the Soviet Union, observed an opportunity to extend its political, economic and military power by extending NATO and the European Union into Eastern Europe and also into the former Soviet space, the Baltic states, because Washington and also London were aware that by capitalizing on the demise of Soviet communism and the demise of the USSR, that would mean the West's overall power in the world would be increased tremendously. So that is why NATO and the EU expanded into Eastern Europe. But Washington and London at that time underestimated the resolve of Russia. They underestimated the resolve of the Russian people. It never dawned on them that on numerous occasions in Russian history, Russian states had collapsed only to be changed into a new powerful Russian state. So Tsarist Russia gave way to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union gave way to the Russian Federation, which today is a superpower. But of course, the West is not finished in Eastern Europe or in Central Asia, because it is desperately seeking the admission to NATO of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. And also the West is attempting to challenge Russia in Central Asia by fomenting civil unrest there. So what we saw recently in Kazakhstan, in my opinion, was an attempt by the Americans and the British to strategically weaken Russia by stirring civil unrest there in the hope that the government in Kazakhstan would be replaced by an anti-Russian, pro-Western one. And ultimately, the Washington and London was hoping to create two exceedingly dangerous fronts for Russia, specifically Ukraine and Kazakhstan. Well, they failed abysmally in Kazakhstan as a result of the rapid and effective response of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. But alas, they succeeded in February of 2014 in Ukraine. And as each day goes by, as each month and each year goes by, Ukraine is integrating further and further in the West, and NATO is expanding its presence in NATO, in Ukraine, and also in the Black Sea region.
Well, since you brought up Kazakhstan, I wasn't going to talk about it as of yet, but let's move on to that then, Earl Rasmussen, and ask you what you think about the developments in Kazakhstan. First of all, we had the Russian President Vladimir Putin come out and said we need to stop color revolutions after Russia sent the troops to Kazakhstan, blaming foreign forces actually for orchestrating what happened there. But there's more to the story. First of all, do you agree with the fact that Kazakhstan was a victim of this color revolution? That did take place.
there's a lot of questions to be answered. There's a lot of confusion. We don't know all the facts yet on Kazakhstan. It is interesting. There's thousands of NGOs that are present. I think NED, National Endowment for Democracy, which is basically this arm of the CIO, pumped in over $1 million recently. There's over 85 to 100 UK society type organization presence. So there's foreign presence and I think it's interesting. The gas was already pre-announced about essentially like a dollar. I mean, I guess we in the U.S. bases have increased over the last year, but it's right around.
Yeah, I'm sorry to jump in, Earl Rasmussen.
And just before Christmas,
we're getting,
as well
we're getting,
as
we're getting you in a broken up
talk.
fashion. Unfortunately, we don't have a good connection with you. Let me move to you, Marcus Papadopoulos, to wrap up Kazakhstan, because I'd like to also talk about, again, Russia somewhat as a focus here. There's one source that has put, and you need to put this into context for us if you can, Marcus Papadopoulos, one source stating that there was a U.S., Turkish, British, Israeli-led coup attempt that was occurring in Kazakhstan. And there was actually a military intel operation room that had U.S., Turkey, Israeli operatives that were working out of that. If that's the case, are we looking at a concerted effort, as you started out the program, in terms of the way that the U.S. and NATO, and now we could perhaps bring Israel into the picture here, that this is what they're after? The U.S. and NATO, well, the U.S. steering this, and as you said, to destabilize these countries in Eastern Europe?
Ever since Kazakhstan and indeed the whole of Central Asia became independent at the end of 1991, the West, principally America and Britain, has attempted to stir trouble in the region in the hope of usurping Russia's position as the predominant outside force in the region. Indeed, we saw a so-called color revolution take place in Kyrgyzstan in 2005, which Russia was able to contain, and which as a result meant that Kyrgyzstan would remain in Russia's orbit. But certainly that there was, during the 1990s and the 2000s, a concerted effort by the Americans and the British to challenge Russian dominance in Central Asia. And in the 1990s, inroads were made by both of them. It should also be said that the Chinese also made inroads in Central Asia in the 1990s as a result of Russian impotence at the time. But still, Russia maintained its supremacy in the region. And following Vladimir Putin's ascension to power in 2000, that dominance became all the more profound. But if the reports concerning Turkish and Israeli involvement in the attempted coup in Kazakhstan are correct, then that will have a drastic impact on Russia's relations with both Turkey and Israel. But what is for certain is that America and Britain did attempt a coup in Kazakhstan. What we saw in Kazakhstan from the militants there was very similar to what we saw at the end of 2014 and early 2014 in Ukraine, namely very well organized, very well motivated, very well led militants who were competent in the use of firearms.
Indeed.
But the CSTO met the challenge. Remember, the CSTO was created to deter, to counter foreign encroachment on the territories of the 6 members, namely Russia, Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. So the CSTO met the challenge and met the challenge emphatically well.
Very well. We have Earl Rasmussen with us, unfortunately just on the phone, but let's get his take on this. Earl Rasmussen, we're talking about what has happened in Kazakhstan, and you were speaking there. Unfortunately, we didn't hear all of your statements, but please expand more for us what you were saying. And you said there are more questions than answers. But again, there are lots of details that are coming out. First, if you can continue, where you left off so we can at least get a gist of what you said before.
Sure, we've got thousands of non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations that are present in Kazakhstan. I think National Endowment for Democracy pumped in over $1 million recently. So there's a lot of questions. Also, the timing is very interesting. Right near the Orthodox holidays, just before Christmas, and just prior to the security discussions between the U.S. and Russia. So I think it's very interesting timing. We also have to look at Kazakhstan, its geographical position, over 7,000 kilometers along the southern border of Russia. But at the same time, it also has access to China and is a key component of the Belt and Road Initiative. So actually, you've got, if you can cause disruption in Kazakhstan, you're basically addressing two objectives of U.S. foreign policy.
Okay, I'm going to stick with you, if I may. Again, we're seeing these details come through as to what has happened in Kazakhstan. And one of the things that is definitely true, based on what the Kazakh president has said, is that there were militants that were in that country, and he mentioned Afghanistan. Now, what is very interesting about that is the fact that you have Daesh terrorists that are present in Afghanistan that have sifted through, along with terrorists from other countries, but Afghanistan in particular, that has sifted through, come through, and somehow made it to Kazakhstan. We know that the U.S. was there. We know that many of these terrorists were either covertly or indirectly being supported by the U.S., the ones that were transferred out of Syria and Iraq, who made their way into Afghanistan. So are we looking at that being the way that the U.S. is actually, at least one of the methods of destabilization of another country, by using terrorists and bringing them in?
Absolutely. I think you saw that in Syria as well. The so-called moderate rebels. I don't know if there's really wherever moderate rebels. But yes, yes, I think you'll see alliances with whatever kind of groups that have closer alliances with jihadists and with extremists. And yes, they'll use that. I mean, will that backfire on them? Absolutely, at some point in time. But they are using, I believe, that there's alliances with the intelligence communities with extremists that are then causing disruption and helping organizing demonstrations.
Okay. Well, Marcus Papadopoulos, you mentioned that these efforts have failed when it comes to Russia. Russia is trying to make sure that its sphere is not being broken into. Obviously, the way it's standing up next to NATO and steered by the U.S. in terms of the eastward expansion, which NATO keeps doing. And it has reached a point where the Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia in a press conference said this is not tolerable, and said conflict may be inevitable of a nuclear nature, I believe is what he said. Do you think that this has reached that point, or are we looking at the abyss but then pulling back?
I am not one for exaggeration. I am not one for melodrama. But I will say this. The situation today in the world between America and Russia is exceedingly dangerous on account of American expansionism, of American aggression. Russian national security, make no mistake about it, is dangerously threatened in Eastern Europe. It is dangerously threatened by the West's presence in Ukraine, specifically NATO's presence in Ukraine. Even though Ukraine is not a member yet of the Western military bloc, NATO does have soldiery of its own there, and it has its weaponry in Ukraine. And the Americans and the British will continue to supply high-tech weaponry to Ukraine, which could pose a very serious threat to Russian national security. That is why Russia will use all means at its disposal to ensure that Ukraine never, ever joins NATO, because a Ukraine in NATO would pose a tremendous threat, a tremendous menace to Russia. the Russian strategic nuclear deterrent would be in jeopardy. Nuclear parity between America and Russia as a result would be disrupted. So Russia will go to war over Ukraine. Russia does not seek war. The Russian people do not seek war. Let us not forget that during the Second World War, what the Russians call the Great Patriotic War, nearly 30 million Soviet citizens died. But if need be, Russia will go to war with any country in the world to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO.
Okay, so if that's the case, that Russia would do that, and it seems like from any posturing that you take a look at, from Russia's defense minister to the Russian president to you name it, they're ready for that. The question is, the U.S. sounds that war drum, but it wants to do it through NATO, and at the same time, it says we represent Europe in a sense, even though it says we have to talk to our European partners. I'm guessing everybody in Europe is on board. Is that a correct perspective on this, or vantage point on this? Earl Rasmussen, if you're with us, the question is for you.
Yeah, I think there's division within Europe. I think you see the French and German foreign ministers going to Russia later this week, or within the next week. I think there's definite division. Europe has already lost almost 300 billion euro of trade with Russia over the last several years. And if more sanctions are put in place that are being threatened, it will have huge blowback on Europe and potentially the U.S. It economically it'd be a disaster for the world. Perhaps Russia would survive better with their alliances with China. So it's very dangerous situation, and I would agree on that. I think there's a division in Europe right now, and the U.S. is kind of dictating energy policy and economics policy and security policy without really consulting the Europeans.
All right. Well, the NATO chief, and I'm not asking you, Marcus Papadopoulos, to go toe the line of speculation towards the war scenario, but the NATO chief issued a warning in that press conference hours earlier of a new armed conflict in Europe. His words, as Russia has stated, the West needs to respond to our security concerns. Of course, NATO, according to Russia, and the Russian deputy foreign minister, said NATO didn't even look at our proposal, even though Stoltenberg said in that conference, we're going to send it to the U.S. anyways for the U.S. to look it over. Are we looking, again, at the possibility of there being a conflict, and how would that break out? Again, I know it's speculation, but that's a scenario that they're painting.
Well, excuse me, Mr. Stoltenberg, but who exactly has caused armed conflicts in Europe? Let us not forget, in 1999, NATO, led by its de facto leader, America, bombed the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which violated Article 1 of NATO's own founding treaty, which clearly stipulates that the military bloc will never use force to resolve a dispute. Who caused the war in the Donbass in the east of Ukraine by having engineered a coup in Kiev against the democratically elected government in February of 2014? The Americans, the British, and the Europeans. Russia is responding to what is happening on its doorstep. Russia cannot retreat any further. Russia cannot be silent on the matter. Sure. Russian national security is at risk, and any further increase in NATO's presence in the Baltic states, in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, in the Black Sea region will make that menace to Russian national security all the more profound.
All right. To round this off, Earl Rasmussen, so you have these tools, you meaning the U.S. and NATO perhaps being one of the tools in the toolbox that the U.S. uses when it comes to these color revolutions, which is our core focus in this spotlight. You have the military side coming through NATO. You have the militants that we know perhaps somehow are affiliated with the U.S. in one way or another. You have the National Endowment of Democracy, NGOs such as USAID. Has the U.S. exhausted those tools as to be unsuccessful, as we saw in this latest episode when it came to Kazakhstan?
there may be more tools. I think Kazakhstan didn't have the sanctions that were placed upon them. Of course, Russia is experiencing that, but sanctions obviously is a major part of the toolbox that is being used to basically launch economic war against the target country to cause disruption. So I don't think all the tools were used in Kazakhstan, but I think it's been diverted to some degree. At least my contacts in Kazakhstan say it's much more peaceful, and they feel much better now than they did a week ago. So it's yeah, I think we've secured for now Kazakhstan, which is good, and they're aware of it. I think they're aware of the dangers on that, and we'll see what policies come out of there to better secure themselves.
Okay, we're going to end it there. Thank you very much. I'm glad we had you. Earl Rasmussen, Executive Vice President of the Eurasian Center from Washington, D.C. Marcus Papadopoulos, thank you for your input. Enjoyed it. Historian, political analyst, and author from London. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. Any questions or comments, do send them to our email address, newsroom@presstv.ir. From me, Kaveh Taghweh, entire team in the capital, Tehran, is goodbye.